So, what is it like to use a Google phone? Does it feel like you've moved to a cave and abandoned tech? Will you no longer have access to your favorite apps? And what's the benefit anyway? I've made many videos on the Google phones, and now we will discuss how it actually works for you in real life use. If you've considered the Google phones and are hesitant because you don't know what it means, sit tight and I'll tell you all about it. I post my videos on LBRY, LBRY, ahead of YouTube. I have a link in the description for you to follow me on LBRY where you can get censorship-free videos. First of all, for those who haven't seen my videos on the Google phones, I'll give you a video link up top and in the description so you can get a more detailed explanation. The short explanation is that a Google phone is based on Android Open Source Project or AOSP, and it also has some software and drivers provided by the phone manufacturer or OEM. But the final step that turns it into a Google Android is missing, which is called gaps. There are no Google services, Google apps, or an actual Google Play Store. For those new to this, I will re-explain. What you get is basically a regular Android phone that can run most apps, but the phone itself does not talk directly to Google HQ. Google does not know who owns the phone, who's using it, and sometimes even what phone it is. There are also other things that automatically stop because there's no Google services. There's no 24/7 location tracking using Wi-Fi scanning. There's no telemetry of app usage. There's no contact tracing. There's no Google ID. And finally, there is no device fingerprint of the device associated with you that can be acquired by Google. The benefits of this are tremendous. Here we can use the phone without the feeling that someone is always watching and logging our activities. This is one of the greatest solutions to privacy that I can come up with other than dumping your mobile phone. If you need to have a phone, this is the only answer for now that is, in my opinion, extremely functional as a daily driver. Some Linux phones are being worked on and soon those too will be options, but at the moment they require some waiting. The question now is, what do you lose when you use a Google phone? After all, giving up on Google will have a lot of effects. Will this seriously impact usability? I will be as accurate as I can with the experience and the problems you will expect, so there will not be any surprises. At the end of the video, I will lay out some rules that will help you retain privacy while using the phone. First, when you turn on the Google phone, you will notice that you will not have ever logged in. It doesn't ask for a phone login. This is extremely key. Without a login, the phone cannot be associated with your email address specifically. Now, many apps will ask you for an email address, but those apps will not be able to associate whatever email address they receive to this specific device. In fact, I can illustrate this better this way. If you have 5 Google phones with an email client on the phone and you use the same email on it and from the same location, no one, not Google or any app, will be able to distinguish the phone. The carrier can distinguish between the phones because of the SIM card and IMEI number, but they do not have a matching identity to connect it to activity. This is really an important lesson that I always impart relating to privacy. Privacy is achieved by managing our identity. It's often not necessary to have secrecy, and this phone solution achieves that. Your goal to achieve privacy is to prevent your devices or apps from connecting activities outside of what you entitle a particular app to know. By the way, privacy can never be accomplished on an iPhone. Never. And this is because Apple keeps tight control over each phone and has a clear device fingerprint, 24/7 location, and a matching identity at all times, the Apple ID. So if some of you think you can achieve this with iOS, then you're being fooled. It would be impossible. A mobile phone collects a lot of information. Location by Wi-Fi triangulation, location by GPS, movements and locations by the IMU sensor, cameras, microphones, fingerprints, facial recognition, and so on. Though a de-Googled phone is capable of collecting the same information, by preventing the centralized collection of this data indexed to a known identity, then the data becomes meaningless and becomes what I call disinformation. The centralized controllers of phone information are Apple and Google. When you go de-Googled, you are basically a free agent. You get to decide if you will allow any central authority to collect your data once again, and this will depend on what apps you install. And we'll discuss app choices a little later. Now, there are many flavors of de-Googled phones. A de-Googled phone is officially just AOSP with no gaps, and they are also called Android custom ROMs. The most popular flavor is Lineage OS, and there are other specialized AOSPs like Graphene OS, Copperhead OS, eFoundation, Calyx OS, or even just a plain vanilla AOSP GSI, which is a completely unmodified AOSP. The privacy benefits I explained before apply to all of these. They're all good to me. And you will find that some of these ROMs will cluster around particular phone models that they specialize in. And they are open source since they are all based on open source AOSP. So we'll answer some of the common questions about the operation of these phones. Number one, will the phone service be affected by being de-Googled? The answer is no. The reason is that the software drivers for the cell baseband modem is provided by the OEM or phone vendor. So in AOSP, each phone retains an OEM area on the phone, which remains unmodified by a new custom ROM. So the only things modified by a custom ROM are the system files, the bootloader, and a recovery module, and whatever apps they add to the original AOSP system files. However, it is possible that a phone has had an update to the OEM software over the years, and an older custom ROM may restore an older OEM software version, so some bug fixes may get undone. Normally, a custom ROM has controls to prevent this because downgrading of an Android version is not usually allowed, at least not easily. It can still be downgraded by using the official stock ROM of the vendor. Number two, what Google apps can I use on a de-Googled phone? Any apps provided on a standard Google phone is gone. There is no Google Drive, no Google Photos, no Gmail app, no YouTube, no Google Play Store, no Chrome. You can do a Google search from the built-in browser, whichever browser, if you want, though I installed DuckDuckGo instead, myself. Waze, which is a Google app, used to work, but now it appears to use Google Maps rather than its own map, so it stopped working recently. So I don't think anything that comes from Google works anymore. However, just about every one of this can be replaced by some other app. Just a couple of quick examples. You can use NewPipe as an alternative to viewing YouTube videos. On NewPipe, you don't actually log into YouTube, so NewPipe keeps your subscriptions only internally. It's not shared. You can use K9 email for viewing your Gmail emails. You can use your own Nextcloud server to handle contacts, calendars, files, and photo sharing. I have a video on using Nextcloud, so you can check that out. I'm going to put it up there. Seriously, if you're relying on Google apps and services for a lot of your data needs, you need to rethink this carefully. It is not good for you. Number three, can I install any of my other favorite apps? For the most part, yes. I would say that 90% of the common apps you like to use will work on a de-Googled phone, as long as the phone has two additional apps that are included. These apps are A, Aurora Store, which is a Google Play Store spoofer, and B, Micro G, which is a Google Notifications and Google Maps spoofer. The Aurora Store takes actual apps from the Google Play Store and spoofs your identity by creating a throwaway made-up Google ID. So the apps still come from the Play Store. However, the Play Store doesn't know who is downloading the app. When an app is installed and it requires the use of some Google services like notifications and Google Maps, what it does is to contact the Google Firebase servers using the Google service on the phone. MicroG acts like a Firebase module by listening to these Google service requests, and then without any Google app installed on the phone, it will forward the notification or map request to Google Firebase servers. So Google still gets the request for notifications, but MicroG provides an anonymity layer since there is no Google ID on the phone. What you will find in real life is that 90% of the apps you download from the Google Play Store will work just with these two modules installed, Aurora and MicroG. Both of these, by the way, have to be configured properly before you download the apps. Still, some apps will say it detects that Google services are not installed and gives you a warning message. In most cases, I'd say 90% of the time, everything works even with the warning message. For example, you will get a warning message with WhatsApp, Facebook, Uber, Lyft, and Signal, but everything still works. Then, 10% of the time, apps will not work at all. So I will go into the next question. Number 4, why do some apps not work with a de-Googled phone? Apps can be designed to be standalone, meaning they don't use any external services and run on the phones themselves. But usually, most apps will require some external Google services, and that is what causes them to fail. The 3 most necessary Google services are notifications, Google Maps, and in-app purchases and payments. In addition, some apps do not build their own back-end infrastructure and rely on Google Cloud, and these services could include databases, Google Drive, Gmail, and other programming tools. This whole infrastructure is part of Google's Firebase. Generally speaking, only a small percentage of apps rely on a Firebase backend. Most big apps have their own backend infrastructure. But definitely, any app that requires extensive Firebase features will fail because there is no Google connection to sustain it. MicroG can fake the notifications and Google Maps, so apps needing only those will not fail, though they may show a warning message. But there is no way an app will work if it requires some sort of payment. This is why apps like Uber Driver and some games and all paid apps cannot work. There is no way to spoof the payment. So this is easy to think about. Does the app function without an in-app purchase? Is the app free? If so, then it will likely work. Otherwise, it will not work. Number 5. Is it possible to use the phone with zero connection to Google? Using any app from the Google Play Store, even if you used Aurora, means that there's still some conversation going on between the phone and Google through that app. It may be using a spoofed identity, but the traffic is still there. For those wanting complete abstention from Google 100%, the solution is to use only the F-Droid store. On my de-Googled phones, all the apps are installed from F-Droid, with the exception of Braxme and Signal. I know for a fact that the only Google services used by Braxme, which is my app, and Signal are Google notifications. I made another version of Braxme without Google notifications, and you can get notifications via email, so that has no contact with Google whatsoever. I now pre-installed this version on my de-Googled phones. Number 6, what do I use for navigation or GPS apps? This is a very common question because a lot of people use Waze on their phones. Until recently, Waze worked on a de-Googled phone. I don't know if this is a permanent thing or a bug, but Waze stopped working. It appears to work, but the maps no longer display. It doesn't show any error messages. Or maybe Google just wants to make sure that we don't get any advantage on a de-Googled phone. In any case, I use Osman or OpenStreetMaps in navigation. The maps come from open source and a community of people contribute to making it accurate. It worked well for me and it's an attractive app. It doesn't work like Waze with all its crowdsourced social tracking, but I'll give that up for privacy any day. Any independent GPS app that has its own maps works great too. For example, for boating, I use Navionics and you buy their own maps. The GPS works perfectly, so the issue isn't that the GPS is affected by the custom ROM. It is not. The issue is only the map and whether or not microG can spoof the map use. Sometimes it can work with microG and sometimes not. Maybe microG has to do some more evasion on its use of Google Maps. Number 7, what about battery life? Does a de-Googled ROM affect this? Most definitely, yes. In a positive way, I have found that without Google services, the battery life doubles. Typically, phones last 2 days or close to 2 days on a standard battery. This should give you a hint of some of the extra activities that may be happening when Google services are running and how extensive it is. Number 8, what do you think Google services are doing that takes up so much power? The problem is that we don't know exactly what Google services does since the code is proprietary, but we can extrapolate from what Google says. One of the things that a Google phone does is collect the MAC addresses and GPS locations and signal strength of every Wi-Fi router in existence. This supplies a database for Wi-Fi triangulation. Now, since this is associated with your Google ID, this becomes an automatic 24/7 location database of every phone. I believe this is part of the Wi-Fi scanning feature. This is also tied to the Wi-Fi probe feature, which searches for routers. Independent testers have found that the Wi-Fi probes occur multiple times a second on a Google Android. The second thing that I believe happens in newly updated Google Androids is that the Bluetooth contact tracing code is there. Knowing how this operates, it would be a common sense assessment that Bluetooth must go into hyperactive mode to allow contact tracing versus the old way where it kind of just sits quietly until you activate it. My third guess is that the app telemetry and the constant checking for notifications must also mean that the phone has to check in with Google quite frequently. Apps that don't need to use notifications don't need this constant network connectivity. So going de-Googled has immediate benefits. And since I already mentioned it, number 8, what about contact tracing? Contact tracing was added to Google services around May 2020. Since it requires that data be sent to Google and the code is proprietary, as far as I'm aware, it is not in AOSP. Therefore, de-Googled phones cannot have this contact tracing. Older Androids that are not updated will also not have contact tracing, and those Google phones that haven't installed an update will not have contact tracing. But it will be irritating because at some point, security updates will require you to update a standard Google Android. Going de-Googled, you can receive the security updates, but no contact tracing code will be added since that's part of GApps, and GApps is not in a de-Googled phone. Number 9, what other measures do I need to do to maintain privacy on a de-Googled phone? The main threat to a phone is identity, so we safeguard our privacy by identity management. There are pieces of data that can connect your activities on the internet, and by preventing these data connections, we can disappear. Examples of these are your IP address, email address, and location. So these pieces of data are given to many apps, and some other apps are even more dangerous because they capture other pieces of data that no one else does just to find some sort of fingerprint. The most scary apps to use on a phone are any of the Facebook apps. This includes WhatsApp and Instagram. So I highly recommend that you don't install those on a phone. I recommend that you allow location to be tracked very sparingly. Deny permission to most apps unless you need it for that moment. I don't think you have to worry about Osman though for navigation. If you're not home, I don't think the IP address will be a threat, but at home, you should use Tor or a VPN if you're on your home Wi-Fi. The other thing I always recommend is to partition your emails so your social media emails are different from the ones that have your real identity. Other than these tips, if an app works, I don't think you have to fear using it. Obviously, if you have a choice, choose an F-Droid app instead of the Aurora Store version of the app. Number 10, how do I transfer my phone service to a de-Googled phone? Really simple. Just move the SIM card over as long as it's the same size. Usually nano is the common size now. You don't even have to talk to the carrier. This is true as long as the phone is compatible with the network. In the USA, you have to know in advance if your phone is GSM or CDMA or both. T-Mobile and AT&T are GSM, and Verizon and Sprint are CDMA. All international carriers are GSM. So in general, all international phones work with GSM. Only USA phones work with CDMA. You can even activate a new service on another phone and move the SIM card over to a de-Googled phone. Number 11, how do I get a de-Googled phone? You can de-Google your own phone if you have the skills. For example, you can follow the instructions on lineageos.org. It can be time-consuming and risky. You can brick your phone if you make a mistake. In general, you cannot de-Google a new phone, so don't have the expectation of buying the latest Samsung and expecting that to be de-Googled. I sell de-Googled phones on my store on Brax.me, so you can go there for options. I can also de-Google phones sent to me as long as it is on my list of approved phones. Again, at the moment, these are the best choices for privacy while still being functional for daily use. I hope this changes soon with the arrival of more options. For the most part, the option of getting a Lineage OS or some other ROM is dictated by your choice of phone. I typically focus on the best value phones, so I don't concentrate on expensive models. This video is a response to the many questions I get from viewers, and I hope this clarifies a few things for you. You will get more opportunities to interact with me directly if you subscribe. As many of you know, I try to answer most comments on my videos while I still can. It's getting hard. And many of you talk to me directly on my app, Brax.me. Thanks to my supporters on Patreon and those who buy my products and services. See you next time.